Hi, everyone. My name is Alana. I am the editor-in-chief of Northwestern's Journal of Law and Social Policy. I'm excited and honored to welcome you today to the journal's 14th annual symposium. Today's symposium will explore the theory of abolition, how systems beyond prisons and policing reinforce the carceral state, and a reimagining of a world without police, prisons, and other carceral systems. Abolitionists recognize that the prison industrial complex fails to provide true accountability, healing, or safety, and is itself a form of violence that perpetuates white supremacy and anti-Black racism. While calling to dismantle the prison industrial complex, abolitionists are also working to transform the root causes of violence and build safe and thriving communities by investing in housing, education, health, food security, jobs, and other resources. However, existing systems in these other areas of society often reinforce the carceral state by replicating models of surveillance, control, and punishment, compounding the consequences of contact with the criminal legal system and perpetuating racial and class inequalities. Abolition, therefore, cannot be limited to the criminal legal system, but also involves a broad reimagining of social and legal systems in areas such as housing, mental health, and family welfare. The first panel this afternoon will provide a grounding in the theory of abolition and an introduction to the abolitionist vision for a world without prisons and police. Building on this foundation, the second panel will explore housing justice, mental health, and family welfare from an abolitionist perspective. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to recognize the horrendous events that recently took place in the Atlanta, Georgia area when a man went on a shooting rampage, killing 8 people, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent. As we discuss abolition today and grapple with the complexities of harm and what it means to be safe, I want to challenge all of us to keep at the forefront of our minds the root cause of this violent act, as well as the carceral system in America, white supremacy. And with that, we are looking forward to a rich discussion with our panelists today. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. We have 2 ASL sign language interpreters with us today, Tiffany and Antonio. Thank you both for joining us today. If you are having trouble seeing the interpreters or captions, please let us know using the Q&A function. I also want to draw everyone's attention to the bottom of their screen. There should be a little box that says CC Live Transcript, and you can click on that and turn the captions on if you're not currently seeing them. If you have any trouble at any point seeing the interpreters or the captions, please let us know using the Q&A function. And also, please feel free to submit questions throughout using the Q&A function, and we will try to get to them at the end of each panel. And with that, I will turn it over to Sheila Bedi to introduce our panelists and begin our first panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sheila Bedi, a clinical law professor here at Northwestern. I am so grateful for the opportunity to be here to explore these issues of abolition with a really extraordinary panel. And I'm grateful to the Journal of Law and Social Policy for taking this issue on, particularly now, particularly given so much of what has happened in our country in the past year. I am going to briefly introduce our panelists. I believe their full bios were added in the chat. My brief introduction is not going to do them justice, so please take the opportunity to read up on the people who will be spending time with us this afternoon. I'm going to start with Monica Cosby, who is a mother, grandmother, activist, organizer, whose life and work has been shaped by the communities she's been a part of, including the community of artists, scholars, and mothers with whom she was incarcerated for 20 years. Next, we have Victoria Law, who is an author and freelance journalist who focuses on the intersections of incarceration, gender, and resistance. Victoria has written multiple books and has produced really groundbreaking journalism on the issues of incarceration in the carceral state. We also have with us Talila Lewis, who is an abolitionist community lawyer, educator, and organizer who unites movements for justice by making manifest the links between ableism, classism, racism, and all other forms of oppression. I'm so grateful to be sharing space with each of you today. And I'd like to start off by just asking you to give a brief introduction about how abolition has affected you and your approach to your work. And TL, why don't we start with you?
Hey everyone, this is TL. I'm a Black gender-free person with a black tight beanie on and circle glasses. My favorite sweater, which comes up, it's a black sweater that comes up and has up my neck and has like a bunch of different material. I'm seated in front of a gray and white wall. Thank you for having me. I think abolition is has to be a way of life. I live, work, think, and advocate at the margins of multiple identities that are marginalized identities. So as a queer, disabled, Black person, it's really important that we understand that all forms of violence are impermissible and unacceptable, notwithstanding where those forms of violence arise or live. So Marlon Peterson from Brooklyn, New York, likes to say that there are particular kinds of violences that our communities will accept, and there are particular kinds of violences that are condemned. And so I very much wholeheartedly agree with that. For me, one important component of understanding abolition is that it extends well into the medical carceral apparatus. And this is an area in which I'd like to challenge all of our abolitionist friends doing work on the ground to really understand what most term the prison industrial complex as actually a connection between the medical carceral industrial complex. And there are lots of connected histories. And just briefly, I'll give an example. In the 1880 census of the United States, there was this connection allegedly found between defectiveness, delinquency, and dependency. They called these the 3D schedules. And of course, it was alleged that people had been intentionally marginalized and oppressed, disabled folks, Black, Indigenous folks, queer folks, women, femmes, trans folks, low and no income folks at the time, remembering this is post-emancipation, and Black folks were freed without any form of material supports. So they were labeled then dependent. And so with any of these categorizations, people could be put into all manner of quote unquote institutions. And so this is a very intentional connection that often gets missed. The same is true today. And I guess that's kind of my introduction, and kind of as a part of who I am, all of that's relevant and then some. So I hope that gets to what you were asking. Go ahead.
Thank you, TL. This is Sheila, and I'm so grateful for that grounding, and also for you really challenging us to be thinking about abolition beyond the carceral state and really being responsive to so many of the other forms of oppression and repression that so many of us face. So thank you for that grounding. Monica, I'd like to turn to you next, and I'm hoping you can help us understand how abolition affects your worldview, your work, and your organizing.
TL, thank you. Abolition for me, it informs the whole way I think about everything. When, as a long timer in the prisons, there's a lot of back and forth between long timers and short timers, right? Folks that come in and out of the prisons, right? And one of the things that we say to each other, and we're saying it as a slug, is that we're institutionalized, right? So the long timers will say to the short timers, you institutionalized, you don't know how to function outside of a prison. And we don't necessarily stop and think of all what comes with that, right? And so, like, thinking about this, seeing it for years and years and thinking about all the whys, right? All the whys are mental health, substance abuse, lack of housing, parole stipulations, all the fucking treatment programs. There's something off in the substance abuse treatment programs because, like, they don't work. But it's thinking of all these things, and short timers will say to us that we're institutionalized because we have figured out how to move around in the system and keep a little prison job or whatever it is, and not thinking about the fact that that prison job means that's a chance to pass a kite to my wife, or, you know what I'm saying, just literally a fresh of breath air, walking from the housing unit to whatever your job assignment is, right? And thinking about the ways, and it's violence, right? That is violence, you know, and we don't necessarily think of it as violence, right? And so abolition to me means like a world without violence. And we find it, and so we find state violence replicated in so many ways, in so many places, including like even within the prison where there's like already just the violence of being in prison, you know, and then it's the ways it seeps into ourselves, right? So abolition for me is like thinking about those connections and fucking severing them, right? For me, abolition means getting rid of all the shit that just keeps all of us in so many places, in so many ways, the fuck down. It means being free and finding ways to make that happen for myself. So it's also a lot of learning and unlearning and doing that with folks.
This is Sheila. Thank you so much, Monica. And I feel my takeaway from what you just helped us really understand and get grounded in is the way in which prison is a response to all of these failures in housing, failures in the medical establishment, the realities of white supremacy, and you having lived that, you know, your response is abolition, and tying that in to also recognizing the ways in which the carceral state contributes to state violence. Victoria, I'd love to turn to you next. If you could help us understand how abolition and your abolitionist perspective has informed your work.
Sure. Thank you, TL. Thank you, Monica, for those really insightful, thoughtful remarks and observations. My name is Victoria. I am wearing a black lace top, dragonfly earrings. I'm behind partially red wall and a bookcase. For me, abolition is what Monica said, which is getting rid of all the stuff that keeps us down. But it's also not just tearing down what we don't want, not just tearing down policing, not just tearing down prisons, racism, oppression, but also building what we need. So how do we, as we're in the process of getting people out, dismantling these oppressive institutions, whether they be physical jails or prisons, or some of the medical institutions that TL talked about that also incarcerate and incapacitate people, but how do we build what we need to not only survive, but to thrive? So it's not enough to be like, here's $5 every day, go live on this, but how do we build within our families and our communities and our societies, the things that we actually do need. And so part of this is everyday abolition might look like, if you live in a urban area, getting to know your neighbors. Do you know everybody in your building? You know, who do you know that you can turn to for safety? Or for help, if, you know, not even if there is a dangerous situation, but perhaps you're not feeling so well. And in the time of COVID, you feel like maybe you should not go to the grocery store and possibly expose everybody else if you have COVID. But you really do need some food in your refrigerator. Can you call on a neighbor to go grocery shopping for you? When you're walking down the street, do you know the regulars on your block? If somebody is following you, and earlier on, Alana had talked about the rise in anti-Asian violence, I forgot to mention with my visual description that I am also a small Asian woman. So if I feel that I am perhaps being followed or somebody bears me ill will on my block, do I know my neighbors? If I see one of them, can I go to them and say, hey, I think this person is following me. Can you help? Or maybe my neighbor just greets me enthusiastically and jovially, and the person says, oh, she knows somebody on this block. This is not a good target for me. So how do we create safety and community and bolster each other's needs and meet each other's needs without relying on these systems that come with so many caveats and impressions? So like if you go and you apply for this, you know, you are accepting that. So that's how that informs my everyday life. And for my work as a journalist that reports on issues of mass incarceration, particularly women's incarceration, it's also looking not only at what are the conditions, both outside that lead people into prisons, but also what are the conditions inside prisons, but also what are the actions that people that are most impacted, people who are locked inside these cages, people who are the long-termers like Monica described, what are they doing about it? You know, so not just looking at them as victims, but also how are they working towards this vision of abolition and freedom and safety that we should all be working towards.
Thank you, Victoria. This is Sheila, and I'm so grateful for you lifting up that abolition is not just about decarceration, abolishing the carceral state, ending policing, but it's also about the acts we can take every day to take care of each other and to keep each other safe. So thank you for that. Related to that, I would like to go back to Monica, who gave one of my favorite all-time interviews about abolition during a podcast. And Monica, I don't know if you remember this, but you talked about how when you were inside, you wouldn't have necessarily used the word abolitionist to identify your politics at that point, but that you and the other women you were incarcerated with were engaging in acts of abolition every single day. And one of the examples you gave is the way women would make each other paper flowers on their birthdays and give each other art to celebrate their birthdays, and how, that act of beauty and affirmation and humanity in a place like a prison was an act of abolition. And that has just stuck with me and informed me. And I would love to hear you reflect a little bit on that and the acts of abolition that you and the other women you were in community with were engaging in every day you were inside.
It was, so for art specifically, the dopest artists I know were or are still in prison. We make stuff for each other all the time to celebrate weddings like our own with each other in the prison, or like a child or a brother or sister that has gotten married out here. We make t-shirts, all kinds of things, right? And these things say to each other in there that I see you, I'm here with you, right? And also says I love you. And it maintains a bond, right? It builds a bond and it helps maintain a bond when we do the same, when we have these kinds, whether we make the art ourselves or we commission pieces. We'll have whatever dope artist we know in the prison on the other side of the prison and send them a message, hey, I need this, that, or the other for my baby who's turning 8 years old. And we get something back, we manage to send it out of the prison. It maintains a bond. I think it's inherently abolitionist just because it's to maintain a bond that system intends to destroy, right? And it's a direct refutation of that, right? When I was in the county, we used to have this tradition of writing court kites to people. So way back in the day, I was in the county Cook County Jail from 1995 to 1998. We used to write each other court kites before going to court. So when you would be in the bullpen, you would have like 5, 10, 15 court kites just wishing you well. Some people would put like scriptures in them. little poems, but we would write each other court kites just to have something to take to the bullpen with us so we know we weren't in there by ourselves, right? And they never really survived the shakedowns, and we don't get to take them up to the courtroom with us. But there are a few that have survived, right? The multiple shakedowns and strip downs and all of that. And it isn't just the art, it's abolitionists, like when we're helping someone out with a post-conviction or to like coordinate writing a grievance, because you cannot just write one grievance and have it copied and everyone sign it, because that's a petition and everybody's going to go to say. So it's helping folks get the same grievance written just a little bit different enough so that we have 100 different grievances about the same thing, right? It's all the ways that we take care of each other to keep community and build community, right? And to me, that is abolition, whether we were saying the word or not.
Thank you so much, Monica. This is Sheila speaking. And TL, I'd like to bring you in on this conversation. You know, we've heard Victoria and Monica talk about abolition as community care. And how does that concept interplay with the idea of ableism and abolition, and the concept that you kicked us off with when talking about the medical carceral apparatus?
This is TL. So I think the first thing is that it's necessary to force folks to really unlearn what they think they know about disability and ableism. That's the first thing. So the frame through which we've been offered, most people have been offered to understand what disability is a very white, European-centric, wealth privilege lens to understand what disability is, and it intentionally erases and elides the ways in which our lived experiences of oppression, deprivation, violence, and trauma affect our body minds. And so what happens is Black, Brown, Indigenous, incarcerated, queer folks who experience houselessness, experience exposure to toxic food and environments and water, who experience all manner of violence, are expected to just be okay. When what we know is that trauma and violence is a cause and consequence of disability. We know that deprivation of freedom is a cause and consequence of disability. And we know that those things actually are utilized then to justify further violence against incarcerated people, further violence against Black people who've been deprived of resources for generations and then are expected to just be okay. And which also, of course, causes the violence within our communities, which is, again, something that gets erased. So understanding how our body minds respond to our own environments and understanding how distress and oppression and just kind of emotions, general human emotions actually help Black, Brown, Indigenous folks to understand that our responses to what's happening around us are normal, and that we do, in many cases, have collective disabilities. For instance, Black folks experience at the sight of the feeling at the sight of law enforcement, right? Or the sound of sirens for folks who are hearing, or the sight of sirens, that feeling that all the Black folks on the call are like, oh yeah, that is a collective disability, and it's born because of years and generations of traumas and violences, and that tends to get erased in the narratives about why we're responding to police in such strange ways, right? Because, you know, it's an erasure of our humanity, our natural responses to things. So that's the first thing. Ableism also has to be recontextualized for folks, because white folks have been hoarding disability. They've also been hoarding or colonizing ableism. So what ableism actually is it's an evaluation of people based on their productivity, based on societal standards of beauty, societal standards of normalcy, societal standards of what behavior is okay for particular kinds of people, societal standards of intelligence, and so on and so forth. What that means is that everyone can experience ableism regardless of how they actually identify. So, and in fact, Asian folks, Black folks, incarcerated folks regardless of their disability identity, are constantly experiencing ableism. And ableism is at the heart of every form of oppression. It's quite literally embedded in every form of oppression. So I think I just want to start there, and I'll be quiet, because I think that lands us in a different place than what most folks have thought about disability and ableism for a very long time. And I guess the very last thing I'll name is that the way that Black, Indigenous, incarcerated folks, low, no income folks, houseless people talk about disability is very different than the white, wealth privileged ways of expressing disability. And if you look at all of our cultural, our art, our music, a friend of mine, Dustin Gibson, who's also Black and disabled, and we created a playlist with over 400 songs, Black music from all over the globe, that is literally talking about disability without using the word disability. So Tupac's music, you literally go down the list of folks, all of our blues music. Blues is literally about disability, right? But we don't often talk about it in that way, right? And so if I'm experiencing a crisis, I'm not going to call and say, oh my goodness, I'm experiencing a mental health crisis, someone coming. I'm like, yo, I'm feeling off. I need some, can you do this, that, the other? That doesn't mean I'm not disabled. It means the way I express it is different. And the problem with disability rights is that it requires that you have a very particular presentation of disability, that you have particularized evidence of disability, and it requires that you rely on a system that is constantly violent towards us. And so we inherently don't latch on to those things, most of us. And so the resistance to identifying as disabled for a lot of marginalized people is, one, we're already perpetually oppressed, and two, the framing of disability has been so whitewashed and wealth washed that we don't even understand that what we're experiencing every day as a result of a lot of violences, and of course there are natural disabilities as well, is part and parcel of what disability looks like. So I'll pause there and pass it back over to you. I know that didn't get to the abolition question, but it's all related, I promise.
TL, this is Sheila. Thank you so much. So much to unpack there. I already see one comment in the chat. Is the playlist public? I think that there's going to be a demand for that playlist. What a kind of brilliant way to really lift up the ways in which race, gender, white supremacy all kind of intersect in our conversations about abolition. So thank you for that. And kind of picking up on these themes and the themes of intersectionality, I'd like to go to Victoria and to focus on some of the really in-depth reporting you've done about trans women in particular, and what trans women have to survive when they are inside. Most of the women I know you've reported on are Black trans women. And I know you have done so much work to provide platforms for what their experiences are. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how abolition is sort of fueling of some of the work you've done on behalf of Black trans women.
Sure. This is Victoria. I have done a lot of reporting on prison issues, including issues and oppressions and violence faced by trans women, including many Black trans women who end up entangled in the criminal legal system. So for viewers who are not aware, most, if not all prison systems and jail systems and immigration detention systems and juvenile jail systems, places where you get locked up and are not allowed to leave, operate on gender binaries. So they classify you as either male or female, and they classify you this based on your sex assigned at birth. On very rare occasions, they might make an exception, but this is after a huge amount of fighting, and Sheila has been part of some of these fights. But let's back up. So say somebody who is Black and trans is arrested. Often they are criminalized because of their race, their gender identity, because they have fewer options. Many people do not have a lot of great options in US society to begin with, to be able to survive and thrive. trans women, particularly Black trans women, have even fewer opportunities because they're shut out of so much of educational opportunities, housing opportunities, job opportunities, etc. So they are criminalized and arrested. And then as they go through the criminal legal process, they are often placed in men's housing units in the jails. And then if they are convicted, men's prisons, where they are either placed in solitary confinement, which imagine being locked in your bathroom, a small bathroom, not a giant bathroom for those of you who might have large bathrooms, a small bathroom for 23 to 24 hours per day. Your interaction with people is a guard comes 2 to 3 times a day and shoves a meal through like a food slot, kind of like a larger version of like a mailbox slot, you know, through your door, and then he comes back to collect this. You get to go, quote unquote, outside to recreation, usually in a cage the same size as your small bathroom cell, for 1 hour, maybe, possibly, and you don't get to see other people. So that is option A. Or option B is you're just placed in with general population, and there are no safety measures or protective measures for that person. So that person is subjected to all of the homophobia and transphobia and misogyny that they are experiencing on the outside, but with no safe place to be able to go back to, without any of this sort of like social support, anything else. So, so right away, there's a lot of oppression and violence and trauma that trans women face when they are entangled in the criminal legal system, both from the people around them as well as prison staff, whether it be the guards or, you know, the educational staff or the chaplain or whoever, you know, who also all come in with these violent notions of trans women, violent notions against trans women. And in some cases, trans women have sued to be able to be moved to women's prisons, which I want to be clear, and Monica can probably talk more about this. It is not as if women's prisons are this like wonderful, idyllic place that people can just hang out and, you know, drink tea and live their lives. But there is less of a threat of sexualized violence in women's prisons for trans women than there are for men's prisons. In men's prisons, there's less of the like overwhelming threat of that. So some trans women have sued and actually made statements and come out publicly to say, this is the harm I've experienced. Now, if you think about people who have survived sexual violence, whether it be you yourself, somebody close to you, some combination of, many people do not want to continually recount the sexual violence they've experienced, whether it be continual sexual harassment, abuse, outright physical and sexual attacks. And they have come out repeatedly to talk about these experiences and putting them in the context of the prisons. So it's not just that prison guard A and cellmate B are bad people, but it's that the entire institution is a place of violence. And, you know, this is exhibited by prison guard A, cellmate B, guy in the yard C, you know, civilian prison staff member D, whoever, you know, but all of that adds up to everyday violence. Like TL talks about ableism and this constant onslaught of ableism and messages being sent that like, you are not good enough, you are not pretty enough, you are not this enough, you are not that enough. And for trans women in men's prisons, there's this constant onslaught of, you know, threats of violence. If I walk down, you know, the hallway, how many people are going to sexually harass me? Who is going to try to touch me? Who is going to this, that, or the other? So in some cases, trans women have been able to find outside help, like Precious, like Strawberry Hampton in Chicago, Illinois, who was originally in a men's prison and sued with the help of Sheila to get transferred to a women's prison, where when I interviewed her after she had been transferred, she said, you know, I actually feel so much safer. Some of the staff have said nasty things to me. but the women around me have been fairly supportive. And there was no longer this overriding sense of every single step she took was fraught with the danger of sexual violence. It still meant she was strip searched anytime she had to go to a visit, back when you could still get visits. She still had to go through all the degrading, dehumanizing, and violent prison regimens. But at least one of those big pieces was taken out. So is that a solution, to transfer everybody to, from prison A to prison B? No, but if we think about abolition sometimes as a series of steps that we can take, to be able to keep people safe while we work on dismantling this, we say, okay, what are the steps that we can take? Maybe it can be Strawberry Hampton says, I need to get into a women's prison to get rid of this persistent and overriding threat of sexual violence during the next however many years I have to stay in prison. Okay, but it is not, let us build a new trans prison so that way we can have more trans people go to prison, and then we can have this special prison built for trans people. But it's that, how do we get people to safety while we work on creating community safety for them, us, and future generations?
Thanks, Victoria. And I think that one of the takeaways I've had from so much of your work is the ways in which prisons, and you said this so well, are inherently violent. So that when we talk about the carceral state as a solution to violence, it ignores the reality of the violence, the kind of extreme violence that you just talked about, and then the kind of everyday violence that just is being separated from your community, and all of the humiliations that happen inside. So I'd like us to switch gears a little bit and to talk concretely about some solutions that are grounded in abolition. And I'm going to quote Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who talks about the fact, and we've alluded to this during our time together, that abolition is really the presence of life-supporting institutions, not just the absence of the police. And I feel like that's been a theme of our conversation. So I'd like to hear each of you reflect about what are the life-giving institutions that you would prioritize in order to get us further along on the path to abolition. And Monica, let's start with you.
I would start with housing, right? Straight up, I would start with housing, recognizing housing as the place that you are supposed to be safe. So it's all the stuff that comes with it, right? It's economic stability, food security, all the stuff, healthcare. And when I say healthcare, I mean the whole entire healthcare, right? Your mental health, your repro, like the whole, whatever, everything that you need to be healthy, right? Like housing as health care, right? Housing as safety. I don't mean the housing like there are, we have DV shelters. There's not a whole lot of them. There are never enough of them. And the way that they function now in too many places is like literally there are shelters that you can't even come to them unless you come from a police station, right? So it's like not that, right? Just the place where you can go. See how earlier you were saying about the language we use? So if somebody is in extreme mental health crisis in the prison, we just be like, they're going through something. And so a lot of times the response by prison staff is to throw you in SEG, throw you in a strip cell and throw you in SEG, right? Our response is, and we learn how to negotiate this with our institutionalized selves, to negotiate this with whatever staff that is around, where we can just be present with our people and just be there. So we'll be sitting on the floor in the cell or on the floor in the hallway, just sitting there rocking with somebody while they're going through whatever they're going through, right? And so it's having that always there, where just somebody to be able to go through whatever thing that they're going through and not go through it by themselves, and to be able to go through it safely and come out the other side safely, having a place to land where you can be safe. I'm going to start with housing and everything else. Housing is healthcare. Housing is abolition. Just housing for fucking free.
Thanks, Monica. And I hear you saying housing and support, but I also hear you saying community, right? I also hear you saying access to community that isn't necessarily a medical intervention, but somebody who can just be with you, bear witness, be part of your world.
Yeah, well, bear witness, but also like be like, oh man, they going through something. I see it and I'm out. Like, that's not what I mean. It's like, I got this with you, you know, I'm gonna be here when it's done. You know what I'm saying? We're in it together, and that's what it is. There's a separation because like I live here and you live there or whatever, but also there's not that kind of separation because at any given time, this could be any one of us, right? That I don't know. Sorry, that's what I got. Housing.
No, it's brilliant as always. TL, let's bring you in. Can you talk about the life-giving institutions that you would prioritize on the path to abolition?
This is everything that Monica said, plus 1,000. I have to name that our ancestors, Black, Indigenous folks' ancestors have been fighting for all of the things that we need literally since first contact in this country, in quotes. It's deeply troubling. So I get really upset about this. Food, access to care networks, like, and not just food, like we want to cultivate our own food. We need land given back to those who it rightfully belongs to, and not even belongs to, who are stewarding the land, so we can grow our own food. We want to be in community with folks who, like Monica was talking about, like hold you down. I want us to really think about the ways in which those of us who are Black, brown, incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, like the ways that we talk about our needs, like we've been very clear about what is needed to make us whole. Disability justice is really amazing and necessary and critical. It should be centered in abolition because it ensures that we are transforming society in ways that honors the whole humanity of every person. It gets to what Monica is talking about, that like whether TL is high or crashed through the ground, somebody's about to be holding me down, and not just one somebody, like a community of people are holding me down. Not physically, not with restraints, chemical restraints, physical restraints, human restraints, or anything else, but in the ways that are necessary to ensure that I can move through that and be okay. And that's what most folks who are, whose bodily autonomy and mental autonomy are violated need. They just needed some space. They needed material supports. They needed love. They needed access to education or language from birth. They needed people to understand their strange autistic characteristics that were actually just normal for them. They needed all of these things, right? They needed people not to label them intellectually inferior because they didn't do well on particular standardized tests or do well in European-centric schools that require you to function in ways that aren't natural for our communities. All of these things actually lead to people being labeled deviant and defective and dependent. All of the things that are quite literally criminalized. And these cages are quite literally forms of eugenics. And that is why trans folks have such a hard time being moved into a facility that fits their gender identity. This is a very intentional thing. And I think it's important to name that. Often that gets missed. Form of eugenics to put people who are assigned the same sex at birth all in the same facility during their most during their reproductive years. Like that is quite literally what one of the purposes of all forms of institution are. And so if we are not clear on what is happening, we allow these histories to perpetuate themselves. So I think some honesty and some unearthing of some of these really painful truths is critically important to our framing. And disability justice, I think, is what, among other forms of justice and equity, are going to get us free. But those care networks are critical. And that's one thing that disability justice provides, is slowing down, paying attention to, honoring the whole humanity of, a support system of peers, not white supremacists, ableist patriarchs who are interested in your demise. So I think that's kind of what I would like to see, and what has already been being developed in a lot of our communities. It is underway. I should be clear about that. We have these dreams, our ancestors had these dreams, our unborn had these dreams, but we are steadily working toward the vision. So I want to just name that as well.
Thank you so much, TL. This is Sheila. I actually am going to ask one last question of each of you before we open it up for questioning. I'm going to kind of take us back to where we started. I mean, we are meeting in the aftermath of this really horrific white supremacist, misogynist mass shooting that happened in Atlanta. And I know when we talk about abolition, some of those who push back against the idea will say, well, you know, what do we do with that guy? What is the abolitionist response to that individual? And how can women, particularly Black, Brown, Asian women who live with disabilities, be safe in a world without policing or prisons? So I'd like each of you to respond to that in the context of the aftermath of what we're living through, and that critique or question of abolition. And Victoria, why don't we start with you?
Well, first, we need to remember we live in a country where 2.2 million people are behind bars in jails and prisons, not counting immigration detention and all of these other forms of cages. We have a giant buildup of police throughout the country, including in Atlanta. And this did not stop this man from going and terrorizing and killing 8 people. So the buildup of policing in prisons has not deterred people from committing violence, from committing mass violence, racist, misogynist, xenophobic violence. So you can say that these institutions already have failed, and we see them fail again and again and again as people are harmed, people are killed, people are often harmed and killed by law enforcement. So for people who say what would keep people safe if we didn't have police in prisons, the first question should be, if we have this giant prison nation, to quote Beth Ritchie, and we are still not safe, particularly those of us who are marginalized by a whole variety of intersecting identities. Secondly, incarcerating this one man is not going to stop the next racist, sexist, xenophobic, et cetera, person from getting it into their head that they should go and do something similar. Because incarceration happens after the fact. It is not a preventative. It does not address or transform the conditions that got us to this point. It does not address the fact that for the past year, we have seen politicians and other leaders in white racist and white supremacist circles blame Asian people for the coronavirus rather than blaming their own failed responses to the coronavirus and to the people that they're supposed to be serving. We see them instead pointing and scapegoating Asian people in the same way that they pointed and scapegoated Asian people since the 19th century with the 1875 Page Act, which classified Chinese women as prostitutes and refused to let them into the country, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then the Japanese internment. So we see this again and again and again. And as TL said earlier, we need to know histories. We need to know about eugenics and how this ties into placing people in prisons for the majority of their reproductive years. We need to know about that these attacks don't come out of nowhere. We see that there's a crescendo of hatred towards people and scapegoating that allows people to think that they can act with this kind of violence and impunity. So what should we do with this one person? I don't have a magical 8-ball answer, as to what would make him feel differently, what would make him no longer a threat to women, to Asian women, to anybody. But at the same time, we have to realize that punishing him in some way does not stop the next person. You know, his arrest did not stop other people from attacking Asian people yesterday. I mean, there was a video that went around earlier today of a young white man who punched a elderly Asian woman on the street in San Francisco. She was waiting for the light to change. He walked up, he socked her in the eye. She found a piece of wood and she beat the hell out of him. And he ends up having to go to the hospital. But she's also left with bruises and, you know, she can't see out of her left eye. He was not deterred by the fact that this other man got arrested and is being charged with 8 murders. He still, the following day, thought it was okay to just go punch a random grandmother who is literally just standing on the corner waiting for the light to change. So we have to think about the fact that the question should not be, what do we do with this one individual? But why are we relying on the system that has continually failed us and failed to keep us safe, to, you know, to ensure our safety, and say, what could we do instead to promote safety? And Monica and TL talked about some of the wonderful, you know, institutions that we could be putting more resources into and strengthening and supporting that would do much more to keep us safe than simply putting more money into policing and prisons, which are failed responses to violence.
This is Sheila. So Victoria really, again, grounding us in the realities of the carceral state, the ways in which it is inherently reactive and a tool of white supremacy. So we can't expect it to root out the white supremacy that animated the mass shooting in Atlanta. Monica, I'd like to bring you in about your thoughts about how does abolition respond to what happened in Atlanta?
I honestly cannot say anything different than Victoria just did. Thank you. I honestly, that like seeing the violence that this guy that just did this thing, this is who works in most of the prisons, right? In Illinois, it is white men from central and southern Illinois that is just raised up on a whole. That's who works in the prisons. That's who the police the fuck are. Anytime I'm talking about anything like this with anyone, you know, my response is, when do you, like, you see the police all the time after a thing has happened. And in certain spaces, they show up and they make the thing fucking worse. So it's just not a thing for me. The thing that I am wrestling with is when shortly after I think I had been out for about a year, and I had went to like a community meeting, and someone read a story by Miriam, right? And it was about a person who had committed harm. I cannot remember the name of the piece. I'm sorry, and it's in the book. I feel so fucking stupid. Anyway, the point of it is revenge is not justice, right? And that struck me. And I had to sit with it for a minute, because like I've been in some places, you know? And so when the story was read, my immediate reaction was I couldn't control it. Like I started to cry, so I had to step away and I had to come back to it. I think I have to remind myself of these things, right? Revenge is not justice. I grew up fighting, had a few fights in the prison about some things, right? And I'm not always, just being honest, I'm not always sure. Like most of that shit I would take back if I could, but I can't. But there are some times where I was like, I don't know if I was wrong though. Like it's admitting that I struggle with some things. And so it's reminding myself that revenge is not justice. And hopefully like reminding other folks, but just reckoning with that for myself. And Victoria, thank you so much for everything you said.
Thank you, Monica. Revenge is not justice. I love that. TL, how about you?
I want to honor the wisdom of our ancestors, Black, Brown, Indigenous folks' ancestors, who have always known that. And that is actually where transformative and restorative justice practices arise. And we need to like name that. I also want to acknowledge that the word hate is often used as a euphemism for white supremacist violence, and it is intentionally leveraged to, what's the English word? Disconnect community solidarity from folks who are harmed by white supremacist violence. And the violences that we witnessed and that communities are reeling from yesterday, quite literally are inextricably linked to anti-Blackness and white supremacy. And so I want to uplift that and ensure that we are not unintentionally allowing some sort of strange amorphous individual feeling, i.e. hate, to take the place of what really occurred, which was white supremacist violence, which is steeped in Christian hegemony, abled supremacy, anti-Blackness, misogyny, and criminalization and capitalism, right? Like, so until folks are able to really put all of that together, and, you know, even like hate crimes and all, no, we need to name what we're talking about, or we'll never be able to address and dismantle it. And so it's a very, very, very good tactic, these euphemisms by white folks, especially in the United States, to take cover from and to hide from accountability for what is theirs to own and what is theirs to work to dismantle as well. And so I just want to like uplift all of that as we move through conversations about what occurred yesterday, and as we watch news media and white people reframe and erase, and some anti-Black folks who are non-Black engaging in conversations that actually further perpetuate stereotypes and prejudices and violences against Black folks and folks who are closer to Black on the spectrum of so-called race and ethnicity. I just want to kind of uplift all of that, because all of those conversations should be happening simultaneously. And that is what abolition is about. It's about the whole picture. It's about ending violence. We're not concerned about who shows up post massacre, which keeps happening. Not that, and had law enforcement actually been functioning right, they would have been able to anticipate this, just as all of our Black, Brown, Indigenous communities have been able to anticipate, I don't know, since time immemorial, when all of these things are happening. Instead, the FBI is more concerned about Black identity extremists, which isn't even a thing. So I'll stop. It's upsetting.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. All right, so we're going to move into the Q&A. We've got a couple lined up, and I will read them and then just ask whoever wants to respond to just go off mute. The first one we have is, here, I'll just read the question. It seems that one of the first big obstacles to abolition is that most people don't see the violence inherent in things like institutionalization. How do we work to increase the understanding so that we can get to abolition?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. So the question, this is Sheila speaking. The question is that it presumes that one of the obstacles to abolition is that the broader public doesn't understand the violence that's inherent in institutionalization. So what can we do to help educate the broader public about the kind of violence that exists within institutionalization?
This is Sheila. I'll be very brief and then I'll hand it over. One key thing is to maintain contact with institutionalized / incarcerated folks. I think that's correct that a lot of folks don't really appreciate the violences and the exploitation and the connections between them, largely because they haven't been forced to experience or confront them in any real way. Those of us who are very full aware of the harms and the death-making machines that all of these institutions are all abolitionists, I think, by and large, because we've made these connections and we understand that there is no reform of these things. They are doing exactly what they were meant to do, which is mass genocide of multiply marginalized communities. Go ahead.
Victoria would love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, what TL said is that keeping connections with people, because again, prison walls or psychiatric confinement or drug treatment or whatever the walls are that somebody is confined to, and they are not allowed to walk out past those walls of their own accord, isolate people. And they do a tremendous job of ripping people out of their homes, away from their families, away from their communities. So you are no longer Victoria, the neighbor, the mother, the person who walks down the street at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to go get her mail, or does this or does that. You are now like locked away someplace else. You are locked away. You are othered, and you're forgotten about. And we have seen time and time again throughout history what happens when people are locked away in places and nobody is thought to care about them. We see horrific abuses happening. The history of the US prison system is rife with these abuses, from physical torture to medical experimentations on people, to today's constant and persistent violence, whether it's sexual violence, physical violence, of people and violations of their rights. So I think it's keeping in touch with people, but also finding out what else is going on around you and recognizing, to paraphrase Ruth Wilson Gilmore, everything that you're working towards life-giving and life-affirming objectives is abolition. So TL mentioned earlier being able to grow your own food, right? That's a step towards abolition. Having access to healthy, nutritious food, not just whatever food is available at the local bodega if you live in a low-income community. Fighting for workers' rights is a step towards abolition. So you don't necessarily have to say I'm going to drop all of my housing rights organizing and my rights, my organizing on behalf of low-income tenants or with people who are facing evictions because the neighborhood is gentrifying, to work on this issue, but see how these intersect. See how you can, bring that work in line with each other, so that perhaps in housing organizing, you might say, hey, we've never thought about the fact that formerly incarcerated people are barred from living in so many places. And landlords won't accept their applications, or their convictions automatically prohibit them from living someplace. And if they go live with grandma in public housing, grandma will get evicted. Why don't we bring this in as part of our organizing rather than not dealing with it at all? So same thing with all sorts of other issues. So you don't necessarily have to say, I have to add on a whole new layer of work to myself and my organization or my group, but also say, how do we do this? I mean, mutual aid, as we've seen this past year, is a form of abolition, and it is a step towards abolition. So it's not necessarily thinking of us out here in the community and them behind the walls, but making those connections, and also making those connections in the work that we're doing.
Victoria, what I hear you saying is that the pathway to abolition, it's not just lifting up the horrors of institutionalization and prisons, but it's also recognizing the promise in our communities and the promise of building up all of the life-giving institutions that both you and TL and Monica have talked about. All right, so I'm being told we have time for one more question. I could talk to you all quite literally all day, but knowing our audience, here's our last question. What would you say are the most promising grassroots and legal movements that are working on dismantling the carceral state right now? And what advice do you have for lawyers and lawyers-to-be who want to engage in their profession as abolitionists? And TL, why don't we start with you?
This is TL. I would caution lawyers against centering and law students and formalized professionals from centering themselves, and interpreters also, and access providers. Like, there's so many people who actually become part of carceral systems and don't really know it. And so going back to the lawyer piece, often lawyers think that litigation, civil litigation, or other lawyering tactics are going to achieve some sort of actual liberation. And we have to acknowledge the deep, deep, deep limitations of the legal profession and legal tactics and strategies in achieving that. While legal tactics and strategies and, you know, laws should be kind of part and parcel of our bag of tools that we might need to reach into here or there, a lot of what we're going to need to get free can't exist within social work systems, medical systems, carceral systems, legal systems, and so on and so forth. And so I think I would just, my warning mine is a word of caution for lawyers and law students around that. And we should be thinking creatively about how we can work around or work through some of those barriers. And what I find to be the most impactful work that's happening is work that is centering those who are quite literally those who are most affected, prioritizing what folks on the inside are telling us to do, trying our best to ensure that we honor the histories of folks fighting against all manner of violence, and that we know those histories and that we're sharing them so we don't end up repeating them, honoring the lineages of our knowledge. So there's a lot of peer support networks. There are a lot of community mutual aid support networks for folks who are in emotional distress, or folks who are experiencing some sort of whatever we want to call it in that particular moment. So community-based, localized work is, I think, critical. And that piece is what is often missing from legal strategies. Legal folks tend to be the most removed from folks who are actually experiencing a lot of the things that need to be addressed. So that's, I know I'm not offering specific places, and there's a lot of information in the chat on that, but I wanted to just offer some cautions and some thoughts around that.
Victoria, go ahead, Victoria.
Yes, everything that TL just said. I mean, if we look at the role of lawyers or people who are in the legal profession and have that specialized know-how, I mean, I think an apt comparison would be the Black Panthers Survival Pending Revolution programs, because obviously lawyers have a specific skill set that many of us who are not trained in the legal profession have. And so if we think about issues that need immediate attention, we cannot say, you know, pregnant person, you're about to give birth in 2 weeks or 2 months or whatever, you know, and you are incarcerated in a state that allows you to be shackled. For people who don't know what that is, it is when you are handcuffed. There's a chain that goes from your handcuffs to a belly chain. Those of you who ride bicycles, the chain is about as heavy as a bicycle chain that you would lock your bike to a pole on. From there, there's another chain that leads to cuffs that cuff your ankle around. So if you see those old movies in which enslaved people are on the coffle or being moved from place to place, that is what it looks like. And in 20-something states, I think, there is no legislation that says thou shalt not shackle a pregnant person who is in the middle of labor, delivery, or postpartum recovery. So obviously, in this case, you know, this is something that people who are in the legal profession can lend themselves to. But rather than coming in and swooping in and saying, this is my, you know, this is what I can do what TL said. Talk to people who are doing this work, who are directly impacted. You know, find out who the local groups are that are doing this kind of work, that are led by directly impacted people, formerly incarcerated people, family members, currently incarcerated people, to the best of their abilities, and say, how can I put these specialized skills to use? In New York State, someone told me that he has a dozen people who are serving life sentences who need help filing clemency petitions. Clemency is a shortening of your sentence that the governor can grant at his or her discretion. But legal services are packed, the ones that are willing to do clemency petitions. It is hundreds of hours of work if you want to do a very good clemency petition. And there's a tiny, tiny, tiny little fraction that the governor will be nice enough to grant this petition. So, you know, many lawyers who do this work will maybe take on 5, 6, maybe 10 people if they, you know, don't want to sleep at all for the rest of their lives. But after that, they can't take on any more petitions. So having somebody in the legal profession that says, you know, I would be willing to do one of those. I will volunteer my time to spend hundreds of hours writing this in the kind of specialized legal jargon. You can't just say, you know, Mary Fish is a very good person, and sure, she did this violent, horrific act, you know, 25 years ago, but she is now a grandmother. She is, you know, aged out of whatever violent behavior she might have exhibited, and please give her a second chance and let her come home, because that is actually not going to fly with the people who make these decisions. They need to know about this, that, the other. So if you have the specialized knowledge, just like if you were a doctor or, you know, somebody else, you know, to say, hey, what are you doing and how can I be of help? And they might say, oh, we don't really have need for a lawyer right now. But then maybe 2 months later, you might get a call that says, hey, this person needs to file an appeal. This is where nobody else in our group has this specialized knowledge. You know, can you come and help? Or you say, hey, I'm a lawyer and you don't need this help right now, but you know what you need help with? Childcare. Because all of these formerly incarcerated people have kids, and it is really impossible to meet when you've got a bunch of kids running around underfoot, making noise and clamoring everywhere, who really just want to go to the playground and don't want to be in this meeting. So again, there are so many different ways, but I think first, to echo what TL said, is find out who's doing this work. You know, find the groups that are led by directly impacted people, not people from up high, and then say, how can I be of service? How can I help?
Thank you both so much for that. And thank you. This is Sheila. Monica, are you there? Did you want to add anything?
So I'm here. I don't really have a whole lot to add. Everything TL said, everything Victoria said. It's for those of us that have been most impacted by these systems. And so for lawyers, all the stuff that you know how to do, help other folks learn how to do this. I'm a jailhouse lawyer, pretty decent one. I know a whole bunch of fantastic ones, right? And so it's remembering that not only do you have a skill that we need, you can also share that. Right, you can share that, so you help other people learn how to write clemency petitions and other legal stuff like straight up PC post conviction petitions or PLAs or whatever they are. Right, you can help people do legal support. And I mean, I don't have anything original. Like, find the groups that are already doing this stuff because they're out there, you know, and support work that's already happening. You can specifically, like the PLRA, the Prison Litigation Reform Act. That's got to go. You know, there are specific things that folks in prison are asking for. Like, we're pushing in Illinois right now to either get rid of or lessen the time it takes, lessen the time that you're on one of the registries, right? Pushing for the right to vote for people in prison. You know what I'm saying? There are like specific things that can be done. And of course, like, stay in touch with people in prison. Just stay in touch. Abuse thrives in isolation. I heard Kim Wilson say this, and a whole bunch of other people have said it in different ways. Abuse thrives in isolation, and in the prison, you're like super duper isolated. Keep in touch with folks in prison.
Oh, can I
Any
add
kind
one
of
more thing to
institution,
that?
whatever the institution is.
I was going to say one more thing for lawyers. People in prison are not allowed to send mail confidentially except to lawyers. So people in prison can write to you via legal mail, and the prison staff are not allowed to open it and read it. So incoming mail and outgoing mail. So I, even though my last name is Law, am not a lawyer. But that means that any mail that I send in and any mail that comes out to me from somebody who is inside a jail or prison, staff members are allowed to read it, and often they do. However, if you are a lawyer and you have one of these lawyer numbers that comes with being a lawyer, people can write to you and they can tell you what is happening in the prison, and the prison is not allowed to tamper with or read the incoming or outgoing mail. So that is a very concrete thing you can do for all of these groups working with people inside jails and prisons, is to be the person that gets the legal mail.
Thank you all so much. So much power there. I'm talking about law students, the need to stay closely connected to folks who are directly affected by the carceral state, getting in where you fit in, whether it is doing the legal work, whether it is babysitting so folks can attend meetings, just recognizing the importance of being in real community, and also recognizing the power that is inherent with the legal profession, and being willing to give that power up and to leverage that power to ensure that folks, particularly folks who are inside, have access and can get their voices out. So I am just so honored that I was able to share space with you all today. I am leaving this just feeling so inspired and like I learned so much. You all were so generous with your time and your insights. There's more questions. I wish we could have gotten to them all, but thank you. Please, everyone, just join me in sending energy of gratitude to this exceptional panel. And their bios and I believe contact information will be available from the journal. I hope folks can reach out if they've got additional questions. Is that all right? And I think I'm supposed to announce that there's going to be a brief break before the next panel. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, hi everybody. I think we are just about ready to get started with this, our second panel. First of all, thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much to our first panelists. It was such an incredible conversation. Really, really thrilled to have been able to listen to that and to learn from it. And thank you to all of our panelists for the second panel. I'm really honored to be here and to be in conversation with each of you. My name is Sarah Rosenberg. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a second-year law student at Northwestern. I am the new managing articles editor of the Journal of Law and Social Policy. And I personally am really interested in practicing law in the decarceral space. I am really interested in reducing not only prisons and policing themselves, but also the effects, the lifelong effects of incarceration and justice involvement, criminal punishment involvement, I should say. So just to briefly introduce this panel, this second panel, building off of the first panel, will explore how specific systems in areas such as housing and mental health and family welfare can, should, and must be reimagined as part of the abolitionist vision. The idea of this panel is really grounded in the Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote that Professor Bedi uplifted in the first panel, that abolition is not just the absence of policing in prisons, but is the presence of life-affirming institutions as well. So when we're thinking about the abolition of the carceral state, we also need to be thinking about the ways that these systems in these other areas can replicate, and often do replicate, the models of control and surveillance and punishment that reinforce the prison industrial complex itself. So when we talk about defunding police and prisons and reinvesting in other areas, we also need to be careful to restructure and reimagine how we ensure that communities have the resources that they need in those areas. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I would love if you could, for the most part, introduce yourselves. So I will keep my introductions very brief and then pass it off to each of you to tell us, if you could, a little bit more about yourselves, the work that you do, and then just a bit about how you came to abolition and to an abolitionist politic in your own lives. So I'm going to begin with Erin Miles Cloud, who is the co-director and co-founder of Movement for Family Power, and also a former family defense public defender. So Erin, can I pass it to you?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Thank you for having me here today. I use she and her pronouns. I am calling in from the Bronx, which is on Lenape land. If you cannot see me, I'm a light-skinned Black woman. I have gray hair up in a puff today, and I'm wearing kind of a mustard sweater, and I have glasses and fading red lipstick. It used to be a lot more red a couple hours ago, so it's fading. I run an organization with my co-founder, Lisa Sengoy, called Movement for Family Power. We're an abolitionist organization that fights to end the policing and punishment of families and to ultimately abolish the family regulation system, which many people understand to be either the child protective system and or the foster care system. How I came to abolition. Well, if you are skeptical of abolition, I will say that, I'm someone that could have been with you, 15, 16 years ago. I don't think that we are socialized in this world to always come to a political theory of abolition, right? We're socialized actually to come to quite the opposite conclusion. So, traditional education, traditional, legal systems certainly don't normally prime you to be abolitionist, right? So why abolition? I can point to people quite clearly when I had my daughter and I held her in my arms for the first time, and I realized that there's nothing safe for her as a Black girl. And I remember just vividly just having a sense of panic that there's nothing in this world that was built to keep her safe. And realizing that while there had been build up to that in my own personal life and my family, and then doing the work as a public defender, it really did truly take that moment for me to recognize that there was an urgency to build safety. I wish that I had come to that conclusion sooner, but from that moment on, I have really been in a practice and trying to continue to be in a political education and learning and discipline to build a world where, we actually can keep people safe.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you for being here and taking the time today, and thank you for sharing that. I'm going to move on to Professor Rahim Kurwa, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Professor Kurwa, Rahim, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you all so much for having me. And the first panel of this symposium was really amazing earlier, and I just want to give a shout out to the folks who were on that panel because it was really so educational and important. Just a quick description of myself. I go by he, his pronouns, and I have brown skin and short black hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. My work is on the experiences of tenants in subsidized housing programs, and in particular, I study Section 8, or what's formerly called the Federal Housing Choice Voucher Program. And that sort of links to the question about how I came to understand abolition. And the answer to that is that the tenants that I speak to and work with brought me there. Their description of their experiences in terms of how their lives and their experience of housing is shaped in this country, centered almost entirely on the way that they were policed and surveilled, both by hostile, predominantly white neighbors, but also by the police and also by hostile city governments seeking to evict them from their housing and push them back to, sort of central Los Angeles. The area that I study is LA County. And so, but from that perspective, it just becomes so clear that when you start looking at all of the places in the sort of world of housing where policing is playing a central role in shaping people's lives and experiences, there's simply no way to understand or conceptualize anything like housing justice without also taking into account how much abolition has a stake in that, right? So many pieces of the process of housing are intimately tied up with policing. And so there's no way to get to housing justice without dealing with questions of policing in the carceral state as well.
Thank you very much for being here today, Rahim, and thank you for sharing that. And finally, Stella Aquamensa is an artist, a peer support specialist, a psych survivor, and a transformative justice advocate from Chicago, who is now working in my hometown of Boston as a peer support housing navigator for homeless women. Stella, thank you for being here. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Stella. My pronouns are she, they. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you to everyone who's here. And just a little image description. I have light brown skin. I am wearing an orange scarf on my hair, and I have a cobalt blue sweater on and yellow curtains in the background. I am thrilled to be a part of this conversation. It's a little hard for me to describe exactly what I do because it's such a mixture of things, and I'm such a young person, and I think my arrival at discourse around abolition was kind of just came from a mixture of experiences with the carceral state and just like a deep interest in it in college. And at the moment, I am working in Boston, and I provide peer support to homeless folks in the community. And that includes advocacy when folks are being abused, often by shelter staff and other folks that are labeled as allies and supports for them, which is, we'll talk about more. That is just pretty much a ubiquitous reality for folks that deal with state-run shelters in this country. And so a lot more of my work involves advocacy than I had anticipated going into it. And then the other element of my work is helping folks navigate the really difficult and intentionally obstacle-ridden housing system in our country, and helping folks get out of typically very long-term experiences of homelessness and into sustainable housing. And that also involves being, a community member a community carer. And I think peer support is really, more than people realize, just kind of a way to model what communal care should look like. It's interesting because it's been so, it's been appropriated a little bit by, of course, by institutions like state-run shelters and hospitals. But ultimately what it really means is peers taking care of each other. And I think I would consider it like an extension of friendship, a way to model like what friendship really means. And to me, that means like mutual, ongoing community care, and depth of relationships, without hierarchy. And yeah, I came to Abolition before I had experienced carceral violence on the scale that I later did. But that really, put a fire under me. I consider myself a psychiatric survivor, and I would describe experiences I've had with being committed, as some folks might refer to it, as psychiatric incarceration. And I would refer to my experiences also as torture. So that, combination of experiences and how ubiquitous those experiences are in my communities as a lesbian and a Black person, really pushed me to realize like the urgency of these conversations. And I think it's honestly just been cathartic for me to write about it and talk about it, and to get to dream up and imagine beautiful, post-colonial futures. So thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to make the space with us today. And thank you for sharing that. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with all of you. I'll just really briefly give an image description for myself too. I have pale skin. I am wearing a pair of brown glasses, brown wavy hair, and I have a white top and a tan blazer on today. So transitioning into a sort of common thread that each of you mentioned in describing the work that you do, I'd love to talk about the ways in which each of you sort of sees carceral logics of social control and punishment replicated in each of the areas in which you work, despite the fact that they may not be per se prisons. And to the extent to which these systems do, how do they rely on or utilize police and prisons, despite the fact that they may not be open about that, or despite the fact that they may be interrelated in ways that are sort of below the surface. And Stella, I would love to just follow up first to you. I'm really curious, specifically if you can talk just about whatever comes to mind, but also sort of about the ways that the mental health system is fundamentally carceral. I heard you sort of speaking a little bit about your experience with that. So I'll pass it to you.
Yeah. Where do I even begin? I think that this type of conversation is a really good opportunity for folks to challenge themselves to think about where captivity exists in our world outside of the places that we typically label as environments that take people captive. And I think if we can understand and accept the foundational, I think, very intuitive awareness that being in captivity is really traumatic, and the feeling of captivity is shared among so many different experiences, even if something doesn't look like captivity to you. So, first of all, of course, when people are psychiatrically incarcerated, they can't leave. Typically these settings, especially in state-run psych wards, you're in prison. You are not allowed to leave. If you attempt to escape, you will be punished, usually by chemical restraints, by which I mean forced drugging. And I think also it's really vital that we kind of name the incarceration is torture. I mean, and that includes, of course, prisons and jails, and also psychiatric wards and often nursing homes. To an extent, a lot of state-run homeless shelters, juvenile prisons, of course, labor camps, like abusive boarding schools. Like, there are so many examples. And this is a little bit maybe tangential, but I think even like abusive households, like children are a people that don't have like human rights and are in captivity in those settings. I think my larger point is just that if we want to rebuild, if we want to approach our goals with that level of optimism, that it's possible to dismantle colonialism and its, poisonous institutions, then we should be trying to pull all of those colonial roots out of the ground, including the ways that we don't even typically think that we're perpetuating cultures of captivity and control and dehumanization. And I mean, in psych wards, for people who don't know, like on those settings, yeah, you're pretty typically like pretty frequently forcibly drugged. There's a lot of gaslighting. There are times where there's overdiagnosis. There are times where there's underdiagnosis, but a lot of pathologizing people's personalities and behaviors. I mean, the DSM lists wearing bright colors as a symptom of mania, which I would argue is inherently super transphobic and homophobic. Just policing people's self-expression, all of that goes to show that these institutions are founded on trying to maintain order. And if something is about trying to maintain order and we're billing it as reparative, restorative, rehabilitative, we're lying. I think that we can, admit that maybe incidentally happens sometimes. There are folks who, of course, get out of situations of imprisonment and are like, I feel like I transformed through that experience. But I would argue that even when that does happen earnestly, sincerely, when someone expresses that sincerely, I mean, we can't discount like the role of them having been gaslit into having to believe that experience was restorative for them. So yeah, I think that if you look at it for what it is, it's pretty clear that psychiatric institutions are employing torture, captivity, routine sexual violence, honestly, in terms of like people often can't shower alone, like there has to be a guard in the bathroom, and it's wild. And I think these similarities are so clear. And the same goes even for homeless shelters that are state run, but I'd love to hear from the other speakers. Thank you.
This is Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing that, Stella. Particularly, I think your point that there are, thinking of this as captivity and thinking of the ways in which control is exerted in many, many spaces that aren't just specifically prisons and jails. Those examples are in so many places. When turning to you and your work, Rahim, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on the housing context and how carceral logic permeates that space, and specifically in subsidized housing, how residents there are particularly subject to coercion and increased surveillance and those types of carceral issues.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a big topic. I've tried to write down a few notes, but I'm going to sort of jump around a bit just to try to cover everything that's sort of on my mind. But I wanted to start sort of historically in a similar way to the way the last panel talked about some older history. And I'd started in 1882, and there was this lawsuit called Falloon v. Schilling, which was one of the first things called a race nuisance lawsuit. And it gets to, it's during a period where nuisance property law was still at its sort of early evolutionary stages in the US. But this man, James Falloon, and this took place in Kansas, where Black residents were moving to Kansas in great numbers during this decade. He sued his neighbor, Adam Schilling, because Schilling was going to build an addition on his property and rent that housing to a Black family. And he tried to use nuisance law to say that doing so was a property injury to himself, to Falun. And the court at the time, throughout this case, it denied his argument, and it said, you're not allowed to sort of preemptively stop someone from doing something using nuisance property law. And secondly, that race is not a nuisance. And it's interesting because that's an early sort of Jim Crow era moment in which the courts actually, instead of siding with the racist argument, went in the other direction. I don't think they did it out of generosity. I think they did it out of, a different conception of property rights. But today, I mean, James Falloon's great, I don't know how many great grandchildren actually could do exactly what James Falloon wanted to do back then, right? They can weaponize nuisance law to simply deploy police officers to people's houses to evict them. And they can use, the municipalities they live in can use crime-free housing ordinances to prevent those residents from living there in the first place, right? So that's the preemption part, and the policing part are both there. And so in that sense, we are, I feel like the arguments of this sort of historical progress, I think, get complicated by the way that you look at this legacy from Falloon versus Schilling to today, and we are the carceral logic that has grown in housing from then till now has proven extremely powerful. And I would just say that, even in that history, in the intervening decades since then, has shown many instances in which white residents and white communities around the U.S., and particularly in the U.S. North, used carceral responses as a response to Black movement, right? And there's some really important new work out by Alora Derenoncourt in the World of Economics that documents that in Chicago, that Chicago basically used policing as one of the most important primary mechanisms to respond to the Great Migration, right? And that pattern just replicates itself over and over again. And if we just keep on that thread of, crime-free housing ordinances, and you look at the sort of map of where crime-free housing ordinances have been passed in Illinois, there are huge clusters of cities in the Chicago suburbs that passed these ordinances as a response to Black residents moving out of Chicago and into those suburban communities, right? And so this policing as a response to Black movement and Black residency has a very strong historical lineage, right, throughout this nation's history. Just to give some background on what these crime-free housing ordinances are, they do a couple of things. They empower landlords to use background checks to deny people housing on the basis of prior convictions. So just building on the already atrocious, racial inequalities and discrimination in the criminal legal system. And more important, and alongside of that, they empower landlords or even force landlords to evict tenants if those tenants are subject to multiple police visits, right? In some cases, it's a sort of 3 strikes within 1 calendar year logic, which has its own roots in other areas of the criminal law as well. But a lot of residents have realized that what they can do is simply pick up the phone and call police or call the nuisance hotlines and get police deployed to people's homes and to essentially leverage those crime-free housing rules to make landlords evict their tenants, right? And in places like Faribault, Minnesota, Peoria, Illinois, Bedford, Ohio, Antioch, California, Lancaster and Palmdale in California, that's a pattern that has recreated itself over and over and over again in many cities around the country. And I've been speaking for a little bit, but I'll just wrap up my comments by saying that this also extends to the world of subsidized housing, where tenants are subject to not just those crime-free and nuisance ordinances that cities have, but then also the additional layer of policing and surveillance that comes from housing authorities themselves. And so the tenants that I interview in suburban Los Angeles, in these areas in the Antelope Valley called Lancaster and Palmdale, they were experiencing situations where their white neighbors suspected that they were using Section 8 vouchers, and their suspicions were entirely racially based. And what they would do is they would call the housing authority or they would call the city, and they would find different ways to file these complaints based on things like, oh, there's an unauthorized tenant living in the unit, right? And those inspectors would show up. They'd come during the day. They would come at night. They would come with sheriff's department officers with weapons on hand, and they would terrorize people. They would, they would basically ransack your housing, looking for evidence of an unauthorized tenant that might fit, the complaint that was filed by a neighbor. And the things that they would basically start eviction proceedings based on were things like, you have mail that's addressed to somebody else, right? Maybe a family member that you're taking their mail to help them out, or there's 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom, and that becomes, a first strike of evidence that somebody else might be living there, right? Or even if the clothes that are in your closet, don't fit the typology or the type that the inspector believes you should be wearing, they will read that as, oh, you have male presenting clothes or female presenting clothes, whatever. And that's evidence, not of the clothes you choose to wear, but that's evidence that there's somebody else there, right? So they're very heteronormative standards that are applied as well. And this just impacts especially family and children, right? Tenants have a really hard time navigating how to support their family members, how to have their children in their households, because those people are turned against them as leverage for these evictions. So it links, I think, into some of the other conversations around family policing as well.
This is Sarah. Thank you for that, Raheem. That's the history that you described, and sort of all the way up into the current day. Clearly, just these through lines are long in the issue of housing. And your segue is great. I'm wondering, Erin, if we can hear from you on the topic of the interplay between incarceration and the child welfare system for both parents and youth growing up involved with the system.
Right. So, when we think about, we're talking about carceral logics, right? And I think the idea is that we were taught that carceral logics situate themselves in a physical location, which is a prison. Like, that's just simply not true, right? Carceral logics exist within the imagination, normally of white supremacists, that then become manifested in different places. Like, they situate and manifest in, what people deem to be like mental health hospitals. They situate in people's like physical sheltering in their houses. And so I think when you move away from trying to create a physical domain for carceral logics, it becomes a lot easier to have the broad-based analysis. And then we can stop justifying certain systems as being for safety, for wellness, for care, for protection, right? I think it's difficult for people to do that because oftentimes we're invested in these systems, and literally sometimes it's personally, because they've been in our lives. We have a family member where we are upset. We see someone struggling, and so we want this to be a different place. And I think for the family regulation system, people desperately want it to be the resolution to family wellness and child wellness. I think people desperately want something to solve what can be harm in a family, right? The problem is that it is just simply not, right? And it's more of a matched imagination than a true vision of safety. And that's what all these places are. They're an imagination of safety that's built on white supremacy, and more of our fear of actually confronting what would make us safe than actually providing safety. And so when you're talking about, carceral logics and the family regulation system, there's so many examples. They force people into treatment centers. They force people into institutions. They force people into forced psychiatric care. They force people and leverage them. If you do not engage in institutionalized care, then you cannot have your child. They leverage your ability to have a family with institutionalized mental health care, right? They require compliance, they require medication, they require children to be medicated to exist within a family, right? And they essentially negotiate the ability to have a family that's one that is what people choose to exist in, right? They negotiate that with what the system deems to be normalized white behavior, right? Which, in doing that, they also create and reinforce and retrench a notion of what a family is. So when we're talking about how do we get here with heteronormative 2-parent centralized families, right? You got there through this system. This system and all laws are expressions of normative values that normally are expressed through carceral logics and white supremacy and some interaction thereof, right? So when you're trying to defeat that, why we have gotten here, then you have to go back and deconstruct it. And when you deconstruct it, like, you're basically looking at all these systems with the same underpinning of carceral logic. So, you know, I'm happy, I want to talk about that, you know, the expression through this particular system, but I also want to really challenge people who are really situating carceral logics within one physical domain, when really it exists within ourselves, and it just really permeates throughout our entire culture.
This is Sarah. Thank you so much for that, Erin. And I think a thread that I've heard in all three of your comments so far that I want to make sure that I lift up is the ways in which all of these systems are really perpetuating sort of very normative white supremacist understandings of behavior and culture and belonging. From, you know, your example, Raheem, of housing authorities basing their judgments of violations based on the clothes in your closet and whether they correspond to what they see as your gender identity, to the idea, Erin, that you brought up of parenting norms being really based on sort of the white two-parent mom and dad sort of nuclear family model. To Stella, your comments about sort of DSM diagnoses, including things as sort of commonplace as bright clothing. I think that's really been very interesting to hear from all of you. I want to transition a little bit, I think, to solutions, and both to sort of existing reforms, if you will, and then also later I want to ask all of you about sort of experiments and community initiatives and other types of things that have made you more hopeful. I think the idea of reformist reform is very ubiquitous in the realm of policing and prisons. But I'm curious to know whether each of you has thoughts about sort of reforms that you've seen in each of the spaces in which you work that maybe aren't doing what they claim to be doing or aren't doing enough to move forward towards a more community-centered and affirming model. So if we could start with you again, Stella, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, this is a really great question. There aren't a ton of examples that come to mind for me of like reforms that I have personally witnessed that demonstrate that that kind of approach can be just like a publicity stunt / really not transforming anything. But one that comes to mind is there are some, well, I know there's at least one shelter, state-run shelter in Boston that is they're starting to play around with employing restorative justice practices in the shelter to resolve grievances, which a grievance is something that someone who stays in the shelter and has experienced typically harm from staff can file. And yeah, it's been running for a while. It's been in the works for a while, and I haven't seen it make any kind of difference. And that's not because restorative justice doesn't work. Restorative justice is amazing. It's because it's being appropriated, and I think it's being used as a way to cover up harm that is happening because, yeah, it creates an appearance of progression and justice and compassion. So I think that's something that I worry about a lot, is the efforts of liberation movements being misappropriated and used to just further cover up violence and abuse. I will say that in terms of solutions and what I believe in, first of all, I'd like to say that I believe in abolition rather than reform because, and when I say abolition, I mean the abolition of like colonialism, frankly, and the colonial roots of all of these experiences and structures of abuse and torture and captivity and correction and control. And the reason that I am is because I think that it's relentlessly optimistic to believe that destroying these roots is possible. And even if we never achieve many of the goals within that pursuit, it will have been worth it to believe it was possible because we will have aimed higher. And I think that we deserve that. I don't think that it's ridiculous to believe in and seek to create abolition and a post-abolition world, even if it's something that, every element of that goal doesn't see the light of day within, like, I don't know what will happen to humankind in future generations, but I would hope that, and I believe that so many of these goals at their core are so possible. And the reason I say that is not only because Indigenous communities worldwide have been using practices of compassion and care and transformation and healing for generations, but also because of my own experiences being in communities of chosen family, of queer chosen family, who every day are using the kinds of practices and like relational care that we see in this discourse about abolition and transformative justice in particular, just in how we communicate with one another. And I think it's so true that the revolution starts at home. I love that text. And I think that when we model with one another accountability and care that incentivizes accountability and provides support to achieve it, we see how possible it is. And also not only accountability, but communities taking care of each other in crisis. So respite centers, I think, are a slightly more like institutional example, I think, of like alternatives to psychiatric wards. These are places where people can come and rest and have the ability to leave. And they sometimes are spaces that are also like really beautiful and fruitful, and people feel like they can be creative in those spaces and heal. And I think the more that we create those kinds of spaces in our own homes, in our own communities with each other to take care of each other through crisis, that, especially when it comes to conversations about psychiatry, is the answer. It really, really is. And it's also like when people are coming from a foundation of that kind of love and care and compassion, there's such a lower likelihood for so many of the mental health, what we refer to as mental health crises that people experience now, which are largely the result of like repeated experiences of violence within white supremacy. Like, who wouldn't, when we talk about like madness, as a person who's reclaimed that term for myself, like, it's no surprise I've experienced madness, as a femme, gay, Black person in this country, having been pushed so far, so I think that's really important to think about intergenerationally, like how that kind of foundation of care and consistent communal love like prevents future crisis. And it doesn't prevent it entirely, but we can find ways to come together and take care of each other even when things are really, really rough. I know that conversation gets more complicated when it comes to prison and policing and like folks causing harm to one another. And I definitely love to hear from the other panelists.
This is Sarah. Thank you, Stella. Thank you for naming that. It's really empowering to always remember that there is so much that we can do in our own communities and at home to take steps towards abolition. Rahim, I would love to hear from you about sort of your thoughts on what has been done and what could be done in the area of housing. And specifically, I'm wondering if you would at least touch on the Just Housing Amendment, which was just passed in Cook County last year. It prohibits landlords from denying housing applications on the basis of certain criminal history. I'm curious to know your thoughts on sort of the potential for policies like this one to actually be change-making, but also whether you think that it could have gone further or has any limitations inherent in it.
So there's so much to say about this question of what to do next. And I wanted maybe even just start by just trying to like quickly catalog all the places where housing justice and abolition are intersecting right now, right? So if you remember to the Moms for Housing protests in Oakland, right? Some of the most, the pictures and video from that, right on the street, the response by the city was to call in not just police, but like armed trucks, to occupy, a small neighborhood, right? That truck that I remember in my mind, like took up the whole, little road there, right? We're just around that 1 year since the police murder of Breonna Taylor, and the Root Cause Research Center in Louisville points to gentrification-oriented policing as the motivating program that was underlying her murder. And again, that's another relationship there between not just housing and policing, but segregation, right, and gentrification and policing. Not too many months ago, there were a number of anti-eviction protests going on, especially in cities like New York, trying to stop landlords from evicting their tenants during the pandemic. And again, the response was police, right? And of course, sheriffs are the ones who ultimately will enforce any and all evictions, right? And here in Chicago, again, the question of housing comes up. What does housing mean? Who has the right to housing? Housing as a space of privacy, housing as a space of refuge from oppression. What does that mean in the case of the Chicago Police Department's raid of Anjanette Young's home, right? All of these things just illustrate that, how deeply tied these two issues are, and just how many directions there are to go in for social movements that are working on this issue. I definitely want to name one thing that I think will not work, which is what San Francisco passed called the Karen Act. And I think you could see how serious they are by the fact that they organized the name around a sort of joke, basically. What that is to say that people who essentially weaponize these sort of nuisance police calls and 311 hotline calls against other people in their communities, right? And specifically here, this is generally talking about these sort of Barbecue Becky incidents where white collars are trying to police Black residents, that abusing these hotlines is that's also going to be criminalized, right? And I think what that is doing, that response is just adding layers of criminalization on top of each other, right? I mean, realistically, these people who are making these calls are kind of just doing what the system told them to do in the first place, right? Why else would the system make so many pathways to pick up the phone and lodge a quality of life complaint or a nuisance complaint, or, and this person is out of place, the sort of broken windows style, everything can kind of be a crime type of complaint, right? The response is not to sort of criminalize that. It is to just get rid of this huge, amalgamation of all of these different bases upon which people can pick up the phone and make these complaints, right? There just shouldn't be nuisance codes that allow people to pick up the phone and say, my neighbor's behavior are affecting my quality of life, send in the police and escalate to eviction, right? That just should not be a pathway that anybody should be able to use, right? And so I think the Karen Act and that style of political response is probably the wrong way to go, first of all. And it won't get rid of the underlying just sort of quasi-criminalization that's going on in the housing sphere just in general. Secondly, I think we also have to be really attentive to the way that policing sort of takes over even like sort of these community spaces, like things like Nextdoor, right, which bills itself as a community building app, but where they have deep partnerships with police departments. It's the information sharing that's happening on those platforms is really troubling. And those platforms are used to sort of escalate and turn into these like panics where, again, the answer is that somebody ends up calling the police on someone, generally on the basis of them looking, quote unquote, out of place, right? Which is, of course, a racialized and gendered phenomenon. I think a better strategy, at least one better strategy, is the strategy that happened in the case that I study in my work, which is where tenants both protested but also litigated to get rid of the sort of policing programs that were, empowering people to make these phone calls and get people evicted. And that, I think, was at least relatively successful because it got rid of the program itself, right? That people could no longer pick up the phone and so easily call and get a housing authority inspector dispatched. And the number of these sort of neighbor-initiated evictions really dropped dramatically after that litigation. That only sort of worked in the housing authority area, and it hasn't really tackled the sort of nuisance code, crime-free housing stuff. But there are other examples of litigation in other cities around the country that are tackling the crime-free housing and nuisance ordinance issues. And I think those, we could maybe think of them in that sort of non-reformist reform category because they are reducing the capacity of people to police their neighbors. And that reduced capacity, I think, I think that has a lot more potential. There's so much more to say about it as well, but I guess I'll just hold off for now.
Thank you so much, Raheem. There's so much there to think about. And I guess the idea of sort of reducing as much as we can rather than simply changing sort of the narrative around, as the Karen Act you mentioned seems to do, is really important to keep in mind. Erin, would love to turn to you and your thoughts on reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms in the family space.
So many. So I think the question started off around also like, what are solutions? And I think I'm going to take it kind of in solutions to what I'm seeing to non-reformist reforms and abolitionist steps. So the first thing I would say is like, I think one of the solutions to living in a world without foster care or living with a world without policing is to not be okay with the quest to solutions and not be expectant of an answer. I really think that's a transformational shift. A lot of people reject abolition because they're like, if I don't have a 5-point plan tomorrow, but how to keep everyone safe, then it is done, right? Like that is fundamentally like internalized capitalism, that's internalized white supremacy, and that's some like your own work that you need to do, right? So I think that's the like first place I want to go with. And then I think once we kind of get to a place where we are comfortable with the destination of freedom being the process of abolition, then I also think it's about building in community with people. I want to just, highlight what Stella was saying about being in like a queer family structure, right? Like when we think about, like people always talk to me like, what about harm? There is real harm in families. Yes, I understand that. Like everyone understands that. And actually, like if you were to center Black trans people who have been like redefining, like in restructuring and like existing out of the nuclear family forever, right? And also have experienced real harm within their families forever. And that also the system has not met their needs because it also perpetuated heteronormity and transphobia forever. Like you see like solutions that people are creating, right? Like let's not romanticize solutions. Like that was hard and we should not have pushed people through oppression, right? To uplift decentralized families. And that is not the way to do it. Like push people to the edge until like, people are doing things, but it's like, those solutions exist in our lives already, right? And, I also think going back to what Stella was saying about being in community with Indigenous people, like we are growing in that connection in our community and in our work. So I don't want to appropriate the work of other people. When I was having a conversation with a leader in the White Earth Nation around the Adoption Safe Families Act in 1997, which was a law that fast-tracked and separated many Black and Brown children, and that person was chief at the time. She said to me, we didn't have a word for orphan until this law came around, right? It wasn't that we didn't have decentralized families, but like these laws create the very barriers that people are so unwilling to say that we can't have solutions, right? People are saying there's nothing, we must have this foster care system, right? This is the only way to treat harm in a family, when actually there are so many people all across the diaspora in our own communities that like this was not a part of their imagination of how to enter in and intervene. And then I think the third, when you're saying like, well, the third part I will say about like non-reformist reforms and abolition, I will say, if you are in the destination of freedom, if you're building in community with people who are most directly oppressed, you will probably already start to build out non-reformist reforms, right? So the reason I went in that order is because they are prerequisites to get to abolitionist steps versus non-reformist reforms. And then it makes it very clear that things like Family First Prevention and Services Act that makes a 12-month parenting class and makes compliant-based mental health treatment solutions to families, it becomes clear, right? Because no one's actually asking for that. So, and I think when people are talking how do we get to abolish a system, right? It's we get to that day by day. We change our own actions. We work on ourselves to decolonize our own carceral selves. We build relationships. We build in coalition. So it's a destination of freedom. Miriam Kaba wrote, just published the book, We Do This Till We Free Us. And then Jarrett wrote this great Medium article about the cover. And the cover of the book is a moon or sun and the darkness. And when they talk about the reflection on that front cover, and I would encourage everyone to read this Medium article, and talk about the destination of freedom for people that were enslaved, journeying to be free from slavery, and talks about the fact that there was no map, and we need to be comfortable. It goes back to Bambara talking about there was no map in the 1970s, and being comfortable with no map, but also being comfortable that we are feeling our way through darkness with a destination of freedom. And so you don't know that you're going to get there, right? People weren't escaping because they were guaranteed freedom. People weren't given, this is the direct map and we know this will work, right? You were journeying under the cover of darkness with the glimmers of light and hope, with an expectation and hope for freedom. We have to have that level of courage. We have to have that level of courage to get to freedom. And I think that's how we do it. And there's lots of theory around, and I'm saying this not in an esoteric way, when you have that level of courage, then read the work. Critical Resistance has been putting the analysis out for years around non-reformist reforms. You have organizations like Law for Black Lives who have frameworks for this, right? And once you have that space where you are in the journey to freedom, you're building with people, and you are willing to be in the cover of darkness with the destination of freedom, and you then ground yourself in the political theory, you start to build. You build, you remember, you reimagine, you do all those things in that order.
This is Sarah. Thank you, Erin, for that. It's a really, really great way to close out this question. I had in my notes for this question, actually, Miriam Kaba's quote, that abolition requires 1 million experiments. And I think that is really connected to your idea that, we don't necessarily need to know the 5-point plan to abolishing all of these systems to start doing real work to make things better for our communities and for ourselves. So I do just want to turn to the Q&A portion. We do have a question in the chat that I think is really interesting. Can the panelists talk about the connection of disability and ableism in the carceral state in the systems they work in? So that could include non-conforming behavior leading to housing difficulties, parents with disabilities having their children taken away because of views about their parenting ability, and things like that. And I will just open it up to whoever wants to speak on it first.
Hi, this is Stella talking. I'll jump in. Yeah, this is a really important question. I think what's tricky for me about answering this question is just that those things are so core to the systems. So I almost I can't think of it as a separate, I can't think of disability, ableism, saneism as separate phenomena that sometimes are sprinkled into these institutions. When we say that these institutions are founded on white supremacy and order and control and punishment, that includes the desire to maintain an order of behavior. And that behavior that is held up and worshipped as normal and ideal and right and good is behavior that fits into some white supremacist norm, some patriarchal, cis het, trans-misogynistic norm, and also doesn't take up too much space. I think that's a big part of the violence of these structures and the control over people's behavior and bodies is like, and it's a great, I think, way to see how these structures are meant to, keep people identical to a degree. Yeah, if you're out of line because you're divergent in how you look or behave, then you're a threat to the functioning, on a very like practical level, the functioning of colonialism. You are like a wrench in the gears, like messing it up. So yeah, I don't know if you're looking for like particular examples. There are a million in terms of this question. I all the time see folks who are experiencing extended periods of homelessness because they're divergent in how they behave. And maybe they identify as neurodivergent, maybe they don't, maybe they identify as disabled, maybe they don't. And it creates such barriers because, oh my gosh, I mean, one thing is that and even if someone isn't honestly neurodivergent, but is experiencing homelessness, their behavior and their attempts to advocate for themselves will always be pathologized. This happens constantly in the shelters, constantly pathologized. I had someone tell me just a couple weeks ago that they attempted to complain to the mayor's office that they had experienced sexual harm in one of the shelters. And the person who picked up the line, who was meant to take these kinds of calls, asked them if they were off their meds and if they dreamt it. So I would say what's coming to mind is the capacity to be believed at a baseline in terms of your experiences. Your capacity to ever advocate for yourself is just constantly compromised by any kind of structure that upholds colonialism's intention to create and hold up a hierarchy that has a necessary and chosen group of people at the bottom.
This is a time where I'm like super glad that TL laid frameworks before we came on today. I want to like direct everyone, like read all of TL's blogs, watch every single thing that TL has talked about, right? Because I think exactly what Stella is saying, like they're so intertwined, TL, I pulled up their page and TL talks about anti-Black ableism is redundant and contradictory because ableism and anti-Blackness are mutually inclusive and mutually dependent, right? So if you go to talilalewis.com/blog, you can read their definition of ableism. And the reality is like the systems themselves are so deeply ableist, like even in the construct of how they function, work on like their schedules, their 9-to-5 schedules, and who can work in them and who can be in them, like not like, and not even just like their target of who they're targeting and directing their action and inactions towards, right? And there's so many examples, right? When we talk about the family regulation system, thrives off ableism. Like it feeds it makes it grow. It's like longing desire is to control people that way. And so you see it very explicitly. Like, so here's some explicit examples. If 80% of people with an intellectual disability will have their rights terminated permanently to their children. And there are states, including New York State, where it's Progressive Beacon, where a disability alone by itself can mean the permanent dissolution of your family. When I was litigating cases in the Bronx, it was whether or not you had a mental health condition for the foreseeable future. They could magically terminate your parental rights. So they would have like some doctor come in and be like, this is a foreseeable condition that can never be overcome, right? We look at the history of the family regulation system. Like, let's talk about Malcolm X, who was removed from his mother. Why was he moved from his mother? Because his mother was institutionalized for being mad, right? This is, and then all the children were permanently separated. And he discusses his experience as being aligned to being like slavery. He calls it, however kindly intended, a Michigan judge who like had control over my family was modern slavery. And he was removed from his mother, who was institutionalized after being an activist and being a freedom fighter after the death of her partner, right? And these are the stories that are often hidden over time and justified to be about safety and to be about support. We don't talk about, you know, the over-medicalization of young people who are in this system, in the family regulation system, and when they're experiencing multiple traumas of separation and harm. And the result is that we need to, you know, they must have a diagnosis. And, you know, it is not to say that people cannot have a diagnosis. The diagnoses are not real or unreal. It's just the fact that you are forced into this and without a treatment, and you're invisibilized all the harm the state is doing to you as well. And, you know, these systems love the DSM, right? Like my favorite tweet recently was like, how do you, like, tell me you have an all white writers room without saying it's all white writers. And someone just writes back the DSM, right? And that's important because when you're talking about, you know, access to housing, like you don't, like, supportive housing structures are built around constructs around the DSM. You know, when we look at supportive housing, there's very little to no supportive housing for people with families. Why? Because we don't actually think people that, you know, qualify for supportive housing actually should be parenting their families. When you look at, you know, what happens in people's, you know, homes and their families when they're in public housing, like those things get proclaimed to be like disruptive and disobedient and like not non-compliant for living in your home as just as your full self, right? And so all these things, it's just like a sick little web that like weaves itself into all the spaces and becomes laws, becomes legitimate, and ultimately becomes upheld by many of our beliefs and attitudes every single day.
Sarah, thank you both for that. Raheem, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to add, or?
I did just want to add one thing, which is that the system of policing and subsidized housing is also about atomizing people. And just the transition away from traditional public housing, federally financed built structures to programs like Section 8, right, which are atomized into the private market and spread out around municipalities. One of the things it did was it made impossible the political communities, the communities in general that exist in public housing, right? And one of the consequences of the policing of Section 8 tenants by their neighbors is that those tenants generally realize that the safest way to keep your housing is to not be seen by those neighbors, right? And that building community with people who are surveilling and policing and just waiting to pick up the phone to call, you know, some authority on you, you can't build community with people like that, right? And it very much atomizes people. And I think that makes it even harder to navigate any additional, you know, whatever it is that comes up, right? And when, you know, family members or people who support you or children or, you know, friends and loved ones want to come over, right? But you know that if there's two cars parked in the driveway, someone will pick up the phone and say you have an unauthorized tenant. It just makes those conditions very difficult, and it atomizes people. And I think one of the things that is really remarkable is the way that tenants manage to rebuild like political community and work together and organize despite that level of atomization, which I think poses a challenge to all these different other dimensions, you know, like disability, but many of the others as well.
This is Sarah. Thank you very much for that observation. I think I wish that we had time to get to the other questions that we had, but we need to leave a couple minutes for closing remarks from our editor-in-chief, Alana. So I just want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists so very, very much. It has been a pleasure to be in conversation with each of you, to meet each of you. I've learned so much from each of your comments, and I think everyone here has. So thank you all very, very much. The panelist biographies are in our program for today. Please do look into their work, follow up with them. If you have any questions for them, if they inspired anything for you today, we're really, really grateful that you've all been here. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. I just want to say another huge thank you to our panelists, our moderators, and our interpreters today. This is Alana. Just thank you all for holding this space with us and for making this conversation possible. I also want to take this moment to thank our symposium editors, Leah and Nellie, for making today possible and organizing this entire event. We could not have done this without them, so thank you. And also, I want to thank, last but not least, of course, our attendees for joining us today. I know that I learned a lot throughout both of these panels, and I feel there is a lot to process and reflect on, and I encourage everyone who's here with us today to make time to reflect, ask questions, remain curious, and take care of yourselves. And if you have any questions that I can answer or that JLSP can answer, please reach out to me, Nellie, or Leah. I'm sure that all of our contact information is on the JLSP website, and you can just email us. So thank you, everyone, and have a great and restful day.